Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count.
Welcome back to Deer University, everyone. We're happy to be with you today. This is Steve Damaris and my colleague and friend Bronson Strickland. And we have another one of these mailbox shows for us today. And we're going to be answering a lot of questions that have been submitted by the listeners. But Bronson, I think you have some special important announcements.
Yeah, some public service announcements here. Wanted to remind everyone and draw their attention to our YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube, MSU Deer Lab TV. You should find it. Be sure to subscribe. And wanted to let people know we made this announcement probably a year ago about the channel, and we were going to, really try to put up more content. We've been doing our best to do that, and we have recently uploaded a video on sprayer calibration. So whether on a tractor, four-wheeler, etc., the best way to calibrate your sprayer for herbicide applications. We also have one featuring Steve Damaris on camera surveys. So a video on setup and picture analysis and just kind of the ins and outs of setting up and performing a camera survey for a population estimate. I did one on deer vetch, and there's some others on some food plot forage species, kind of some species profiles. So just wanted to bring everyone's attention to that. If you're not into YouTube or haven't been to our channel in a while, there's some new videos there, so tune into that.
And while we're plugging individuals here, we got Luke Resop did a nice little video on, he does a lot of different videos, but I think the most recent one was on differentiating some of the invasive, one invasive legume in particular.
Yeah, that was, I think that was
Sericea lespedeza.
Sericea lespedeza, yeah. That was probably about a month ago or 6 weeks ago. Yeah, he's got that one up there. So we have quite a few up there. And another thing, Steve, I wanted to remind people about is our online seminar series. And essentially, that is our deer management workshop that we developed and delivered for many, many years. And we realized the logistics, of course, people can't make it to all of those. And it is essentially, I believe it's 8 presentations, if I remember correctly. All of them are the long form of communication. So it's not a social media soundbite or anything. These are the bona fide hour and a half, sometimes 2 hour long seminars and presentations. And those are free to watch. I'll provide a link for people in the show notes. You can go there, click on the link, and we have 2 options there. You can, like I said, watch it free of charge, but also, if you're a professional in natural resources like a logger, registered forester, wildlife biologist, and you need professional credit hours, we also have the opportunity for you to watch those for credit hours as well. So just wanted to remind people of those opportunities. Okay, Steve, well, we're getting back to our Q&A episodes here. So as we mentioned in the last episode, it was very successful in terms of people reaching out and providing questions. So many that we're going to have 3 or 4 episodes to get to all of them. The category we're going to work on today is buck movement and hunting strategy. And our first question is from Joseph Montz. And he is wanting to know, I don't know where he's located, but is wanting to know about how bucks travel to food plots in the evening. Have we done any research on how they get there? Is it a straight shot, or do they take crazy ventures to get there, even if they're only bedded about 100 yards away? Other question is the average travel circumference of mature bucks in daylight, pre-rut, rut and post-rut. So 2 parts there.
Okay, well, Joseph, a great question on access and food plots, and I think the key here is they're generally going to be doing some crazy ventures, delaying their entrance into the food plot, oftentimes until right before dark or right after dark. And so my personal strategy for hunting a food plot, if you have deer that are more elusive, you need to be hunting where they're coming from, in between where they were and where they're coming for food. Our telemetry data, our collared data, shows that they're entering food plots much more at night than they are in the daytime. And so they're also bedded somewhere, and they may be relatively close to the food plot, but they're not coming into that food plot much before dark. So find travel corridors, particularly covered areas with good cover, linear areas between a really heavy cover where they might be bedded, and then linear areas of vertical structure that they can walk through and feel safe. And I would hunt along that travel corridor into the food plot. Catch them before they get there, because it's going to be more daylight then. So that's how I would answer that.
Can I add 2 cents to that?
Oh, please do.
So I think, of course, I agree with everything you said. I would also add that the crazy venture, route or not, or taking a straight shot, is going to be dependent on that cover, and is it providing a cover corridor to the plot. Mm-hmm. So if all around 350 degrees around that food plot, it is wide open and there's a cover corridor to a bedding area, that's a straight shot. I would say bucks as well as deer are more or less going to take a straight shot utilizing the cover. But if the cover that is going to the plot is a crazy venture, in other words, they might have to walk 300 yards to cover 100 yards to stay in that cover corridor, then they're probably going to take that route. Just always having escape cover nearby.
Yeah, and the thing to keep in mind is the deer aren't in any rush. They might take an hour to walk 100 yards. And we've all seen them. We've been in the situations where a deer comes out and stops and doesn't move for minutes and minutes and more minutes, and because they're not sure about something. They're patient. They'll wait as long as they need to. If they feel a little threatened, they'll turn around and go back out and head back where they came from very easily, and maybe circle around or whatever. Another thing besides the travel corridors with vertical structure, if I could blend in some of our work with mid-rotation management, and we're doing some selective herbicide work to remove low quality woody vegetation, and adding in some burning to promote generation of really high quality forbs and good foods, and then letting that forage be, and typically if you're burning, you're going to have some pretty tall forbs that very next growing season. So it's not like you're just going to have stuff 6 inches off the ground. So this proper, what I would call proper mid-rotation management in pine systems at least, will provide some structural cover, but also importantly food. So they are moving through that cover/food experience many minutes, maybe even an hour or two before they would normally have headed towards the food plot. If there's food along the way, they can be doing what they want ultimately is to eat in the food plot. Well, they can be doing that on their way and feeling a sense of security in some relative high vegetation that's responded to the herbaceous vegetation that's responded to the prescribed fire. So to me, that's an excellent ideal situation. Provide them some structure that is also food, and you cannot go wrong. Now that's going to slow them down maybe a little more because they're eating along the way instead of just walking, but that's to the best advantage of the deer population, and you just need to figure out where to hunt and hunt in off of the food plot, like I mentioned earlier.
You made a good point there, Steve. With something we, what's the word? We're an anthropomorphic characteristic. Not really, but deer in no rush. And we tend to think about, the sun is setting and hurry up. We want them to get there during daylight hours, but a deer's in no rush. It's got an hour after sunset, 2 hours after sunset. It's going to take its time and be careful.
And they're not going anywhere.
They're not going
They're
anywhere.
Where they live.
Yep.
You've moved into where they live for your set amount of hours, and you want them to behave on your schedule.
Right. Yes,
Ain't going to happen. It is not going to happen. So you really need to better understand their schedule and why they're moving and when. And that's what we try to do with our research and this educational outreach. So the second question, and maybe that's what you were just about to move to?
Well, I made a mistake. I thought that was part 2 to Joseph's. It's actually a separate question by Austin Sims.
Yes. Talking about what's the average circumference, or I think movement of mature bucks during the daylight, daytime movements during the pre-rut, rut, and post-rut. So you want to talk about that?
I'll give my 2 cents and qualify. I don't have the perfect answer for the daylight part, nor do I really know the circumference. But what sticks with me is something we were looking at in our buck movement study that I really, really like, is that it did not matter what time of year, pre-rut, early rut, peak rut, post-rut, etc. Even though deer may be moving more, their average home range, so remember we calculated those daily home ranges, and it was always around 200 acres.
Yeah.
Didn't matter the time of year. It was like on a daily scale, that's kind of the management unit for a buck, is they're going to use about 200 acres. What changes over time is that when you remove rut out of the equation, the 200 acres one day is pretty much going to be the same 200 acres or adjacent to it the next day. So those 200-acre daily home ranges are very close together. But when you get into the rut, and especially the peak rut, those 200 acres can be far away. They've picked up and moved 1,000 yards or so away and spent a day in 200 acres.
That's right. And qualifying that a little even more, that 200 acres per day is an average for a whole bunch of bucks that we monitored over a whole bunch of time periods. And there's always going to be some bucks that are making an excursion, where an excursion is, might be 2 or 3 miles in a day out and back, or maybe within 2 days. So there's these bursts of extreme movement, not to mention our migratory mobile personality bucks. That's another whole area. But, there are these short-term movements, extreme movements of pretty much all deer, be it excursion or migratory movements. And but the average, and that 200 acres is a pretty good size to think about. That's where you're, as a hunter, you got to figure out where within that 200 acres is the buck right now, and where is he heading in the next hour or two.
Yep.
That's not easy.
Not at all.
It takes some natural woodswomanship, getting out there and looking at the landscape and looking at your aerial photos and trying to figure out where deer may be moving, where they may be bedding, and where are their food sources. And I know it's hard if you're not a deer biologist to go out in the woods and see these things, because you don't see the same things we do. So how would you help our listeners, Bronson? How would you tell them to go out and find food sources in the woods walking around?
Well, why don't we simplify it a little bit, and maybe we're not even looking for food. Let's say at that time of year that the food plots were going to be the primary source of food. So, that's something that you can isolate. And if you had cameras around that food plot, then that buck, every day, every other day, once a week is making it to that food plot. I would then, of course, it's just scouting and sign. I would be walking around there and looking for the trails that are entering that plot and look at the activity associated with that, how recent it is. And another thing to consider with some of these older bucks is some of the scouting that you might be doing this year may not pay dividends this year. It may be paying off the next year or the year after, figuring out where these kind of traditional travel corridors are coming to that food plot. But I guess very simply to answer your question, how I would figure that out is I'm going to, number one, look for deer sign regarding the plants. If there's a lot of forage in the woods, I'm going to be looking for the plants that are showing that they've been that browse, that the deer are browsing them. I'm going to look for tracks. I'm going to look for poop. And that's how I would start the process.
And I think most hunters that are used to being on food plots, there's patterns of where the deer enter the food plot. Year in, year out, week in, week out. They tend to come in these 2 or 3 different directions. And so to me, that would be a place to go to start finding the trails. Don't just wander through the woods necessarily. Be focused on where you're seeing the deer coming out from. Find those trails. And, I really agree. I agree with everything you say, Bronson, always. But your really great point you made there is don't necessarily do it for this year. Invest in it for next year, because you may be messing up the deer's access to the food plot for the next week by following this trail.
Exactly.
But once you know it, you can put up some trail cameras, and you don't need baited trail cameras. You just have trail camera along the trail and figure out when they're coming and who's coming.
Right.
And that way you'll have it moving forward in future for increasing your effective hunting.
Yeah, and that's precisely one of the reasons why I said it may not be effective this year or the next week, because you're disturbing the site, essentially. You're traipsing through the very area you want the deer to come, and so you're disturbing them. So it may be several weeks before they start using the exact same pattern that they were before you disturbed the site.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't fully appreciate that. They want to go out and scout in September in preparation for mid-October or November hunting. And there's a lot of our bucks that shift, even the sedentary bucks that have a single home range, they're shifting their movements within time periods. And those 200-acre home ranges, that daily home range thing, think about a 200-acre area today won't necessarily be the same 200-acre area 3 or 4 weeks later. Might be shifted, 1,000 yards away. And so they were taking advantage of changing food sources and also adjusting to risk changes as more and more perceived risk is on the landscape.
Okay. Our next question is from Caleb Simon. Kind of a long, so I'll hit the high points here. I think the main question is, why do some bucks make drastic changes to their home range mid-life cycle? We've had some bucks on the farm for a year or two and then make a sudden disappearing act, only to show up elsewhere and or return a year or two later. So I think that kind of dovetails into what you were talking about, Steve, with these mobile personality bucks and excursions and shifting their home ranges.
Yeah, and it's so hard to really, if you're on and thank you, Caleb, for this question. He mentions he has 120 acres and then some additional property that he has permission to access. So he's running cameras on about 300 acres. And, that's a small portion of the average, even the average sedentary buck's annual home range. So there's a portion of the year that he may be seeing bucks and then they leave because they're no longer needing what's on that property. That's why we like to talk about providing the even on a small property, using effective habitat management to generate cover and food supply on your property, and that way you have more chance of holding them onto your property. But depending upon Caleb's habitat characteristics and land cover, they may be moving off and then back on to take advantage of a seasonal resource. And I remember back years ago in South Texas doing movement studies where mid-age bucks were changing home ranges across. I remember one in particular. Goodness, he worked a swath of 8 or 9 miles across this property, this landscape, and it was seasonal home ranges that were just kind of shifting. He was literally moving across the landscape in large blocks of area, and I thought, well, when is he going to decide where he wants to live? He was just a roamer, and we talk about our migratory or mobile personality. This guy never did make up his mind where he wanted to be. He wasn't moving between two places. He was just moving every few months across the landscape.
Do you remember back then? What was it, repeatable from year to year? I don't know if you had collar on him or observations.
I think we had him for a couple of years, and as I recollect, he never really came back to where he was when we collared him. Yeah. He was just moving around.
Another, I think, aspect to Caleb's question here, I'm focusing on the word why. Why do some bucks make these drastic changes? To me, the answer is we don't know fully. But so there's like what you described, Steve, where there can be something very obvious in terms of resources are not as available as maybe they used to be. Mm-hmm. So the cover resources have been diminished, or the food resources have been diminished, and he decides to move off the property or go somewhere else. But simultaneously, Steve, we have some bucks in our GPS collar study. We have said that we don't think that's the answer. The place they're at has a lot of food. The place they moved to 10 miles away has a lot of food. It's just one of those, we don't know why they picked up and moved.
Yeah, and I like to talk about it just as a deep time adaptation to knowing where things are for the benefit of the population. And it's not something they're thinking about doing, but there's value in risk takers. And we see it in the human population that there's people that take risks, and a lot of them crash and burn and they don't succeed, but some of them succeed really well. Yeah. And are famous for it. And then there's a bunch of people that are just kind of, I'm happy where I am. I don't need to take risk.
I'm good.
Stay in my bubble. I know where things are, and you're not going to necessarily get hurt, but you're not necessarily going to advance far either. So there's some benefit to this risk-taking behavior, and we see major movements, seasonal movements up north in response to the extreme temperatures changes between wintering yards and going back down to their summering areas. Out west, it's an elevational shift, not necessarily across the landscape. And down here, we may have some flooding patterns, historical flooding patterns that are driving some of these changes. Some of our big movers are moving in March and August between places, and March is kind of a period. If you're in a major river system, there's sometimes going to be flooding in March. So maybe there's some historical stimulation to be doing these movements, but they're not necessarily proximate, meaning, there's not necessarily any flooding this year, but the deer's just learned that generally it's a good idea to move somewhere. So there's a variety of reasons, and I agree 100%, Bronson. We don't know why any individual deer is moving, kind of sum it up. But there's a lot of potential reasons why deer would want to move. And, heck, if they were really simple and easy, it wouldn't be near as fun to chase around the landscape.
And we might be out of a job.
Yeah. If nobody needed, if all these people didn't have questions, what would we be doing?
Well, Caleb offered his 2 cents. So I think it's good to address this. Caleb says, personally, I think a contributing factor is the amount of does on the farm. I guess I would reply to that very similar to what I said a moment ago, that very well could be the answer, but to me it would be from the perspective of if the number of does is diminishing the amount or quality of cover or food resources available. I don't think it is simply because we have a bunch of does and it's some type of social response, which I've heard some other people say in the past that there's just too many does and it's driving other deer away, like it's almost a dominance effect, that too many does and the bucks don't want to be around them or something. I don't believe that, and I don't think there's any evidence to support that. So I would follow up on Caleb's comment there about the number of does with an if they were diminishing food or cover some to the extent that a buck says, I can make a better living more easily on the next farm over or the next property over. Or a particular buck is doing just what we described earlier. They have that exploratory, colonizing gene, for lack of a better word. They just have that tendency that they're going to ramble. They're going to move on.
Yep, and a related point that Caleb makes here, he says, we take a lot of does off the farm every year, but it doesn't seem to change the numbers. To me, what that's telling me is that they think they're taking a lot of does off the farm, but they're not taking near as many as they need to if they really want to substantively change the number of deer on the landscape.
Yeah.
And
they may not have enough acreage to do that. So they may be killing a lot of does on 100 plus acres, 120 acres. But gosh, if no one around you is doing that,
that's right,
then very little effect at the population level or landscape level.
Yeah, and talking about does and does affecting buck movements gets me thinking about the debate of when should you harvest your does. And you and I, we've talked about this many times with other people, and there's one camp that says I want as many does on my property during the rut so that it'll bring in the bucks. And if I shoot all the does before the rut, there won't be any does as many, and so the bucks aren't going to be on my property. To me, as a manager, I want, if you have to remove 20 does from your property and maybe a certain number of bucks as part of population control, you ought to be doing that early in the season so that come rut, you can have a nice quiet, less harvesting rate time period, and just focus on watching the does that you have and the bucks coming on and attempting to service those does.
Right.
And because if you wait until after the rut, you're not going to get as many harvested as you need to. I would bet money and win more than half the time. If you wait until after the rut, you are not going to get the right number of animals removed as part of population control. So do it early, and then let things settle down and enjoy that rut hunting.
Yeah. But okay, well, but let me pose that question to you, but you're not saying if you didn't get it done to just stop.
Oh no.
So you're advocating. So let's say you used the number 20 a moment ago. So you're at the pre-rut, rut, etc. You've only got 11 of those 20 does killed. You're gonna stay at it during the rut if you have an opportunity?
Good question. I guess it depends on how reliable I and my colleagues would be in harvesting after the rut.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I would like to kind of take it easy on the does during the rut, just to kind of keep things a little quieter.
Okay.
But I'm going to come back. I'm not going to just, I just don't, I'm tired of it now. I've hunted a lot during the rut. I don't think I'll bother anymore. I'll get those does next year. It won't matter.
You're going to make a concerted effort in the post-rut, and a lot of this all depends, Steve, on when your hunting season is relative to the rut.
Yes.
Some places you can do this a lot easier. So you have the rut and then you have another 6 weeks after the rut. Okay. But in some places, the rut is just coming on when deer season is ending.
Mm-hmm.
So by all means, you need to get it knocked out before the rut if that's what you're going to do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Caleb, for a bunch of good topics and questions. Oh, and Caleb is from Ohio, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, John Leake is next up. Do bucks keep the same pattern of feeding, bedding, checking scrapes throughout the rut, or do they do something different when rut is in full swing?
I guess I would break that down into, do they keep the same pattern in terms of, are they going to feed, are they going to bed? Yes, but the extent of which they do it is going to change from before the rut, during the rut, and after the rut. Meaning that if you look at the proportion of their day in the before the rut and the pre-rut, peak rut, etc., that changes throughout, meaning that a greater proportion of their time will be spent bedding outside of the rut. Mm-hmm. A greater proportion of their time will be moving during the rut, which means less time will be spent bedded during the rut. So they're not abandoning. All those things are critical. They have to eat, they
mm-hmm.
have to bed, etc. They're just changing how much of their time they're allocating to each of those behaviors. Checking scrapes, that is going to diminish after the pre-rut, actually. I think you're going to see, and
mm-hmm.
we've got this study we may have spoken about on the last Q&A a little bit, but examining scrapes, and that's one of the things we hope to define a little bit better. But what we're seeing so far is the greatest scrape activity is pre-rut. And then it starts declining in the peak of the rut. So, again, none of it, they don't abandon any of those behaviors. They just change how often they do them.
Yeah, think about it as you're a restaurateur, and you're going to be really busy advertising your restaurant when you're not having a lot of customers there. And so you advertise, scraping is a social signpost. And so you're doing your advertisement before the lunch crowd and the dinner crowd come in. Mm-hmm. Once the dinner crowd and the lunch crowd are there, you're busy doing other things. You're not advertising, you're servicing.
You're cooking food.
Yep. And talking about the changes in behavior, one of our graduate students, Ashley, worked on quantifying behaviors, bedded, feeding or tending, and then walking or traveling in linear distances by those phases of the rut. And during the pre-rut, they spent 50% of their time bedded, and then during the peak rut, it dropped down to 40% of their time bedded. But like you said, they're still bedding during the rut. It's not like they're moving constantly. It's just a change from 50 to 40% of their time. That's a big change, but they're still bedded a lot. and their time spent walking from pre-rut was about 15%, and it went up to 25% peak rut. So they're spending less time bedded, more time walking, and then their feeding time is spent relatively constant across that time period. So they're just changing bedded versus walking activities.
And how this is a little off topic, but how I reconcile then that why do bucks lose so much weight? So someone might examine what you just said, Steve, and they say, you just said they're spending about the same amount of time feeding, but they're also spending a greater amount of time walking.
Mm-hmm.
So, they're taking in about the same amount of food, but they're expending a lot more energy. And so that's why we see those declines in body weight over the years.
Yeah, and two, let me clarify, we called it feeding/tending behaviors, but we don't know exactly what they were doing. It's just based on the movement rate and the turning angles of the locations between one location and another. We're identifying a type of movement behavior. And we do know that bucks are going to lose 25% of their body weight during the breeding season, and they will, in fact, decrease the amount of food that they eat. So, too, will the does during the winter time period. They'll reduce the amount of food they eat. And that's a deep time adaptation to periods of less food available during the winter time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to happen, and then when you add in they may be behaving similarly, but they're not eating as much while they're doing similar behavior during the peak of the rut, and they're exercising a whole lot more. If we all cut our consumption rate by 20% and increased our exercise rate by 30 or 40%, we're going to lose weight.
Yeah, we'd all look a little better, wouldn't we?
Well, you're already. I mean, you're at the peak of perfection right now, my friend. I don't know.
You just demonstrated how bad your eyesight has become. Next one is from Steve Burnham, and he is in north central Oklahoma. And one thing that he says is different at his place. He hunts exclusively agricultural land. There are a lot of summer crops, corn, milo, soybean, etc. Winter crops are almost always winter wheat. So this is like a Midwest context here. It sounds like there's plenty of food. The problem I run into is I see a lot of deer, but the bucks don't usually stay. I see them split up early, like the last few weeks. I see them traveling to other doe groups in the area, but can't figure out any pattern. So that's kind of, I guess, the question. Any ideas on getting them to come back more often during hunting season?
Food and cover.
Yeah.
My knee jerk.
Well, in terms of all you can do, that's really all you can do. We just, I feel like we're sounding like a broken record with this buck personality thing we keep talking about, but we don't know why some of these bucks just pick up and move away. A lot of them are sedentary and they stay put. You're going to see them year after year after year, and some of them get up and move. And so far, Steve, we haven't found any reliable pattern to attribute to why does this buck do it and these bucks don't. We really don't know.
Yeah, and those mobile bucks that are living in two different places and just traveling in between, some of our bucks that behave that way, they make a one time a year move from location A to location B, and then 3, 4, 5 months later they'll make another move back to location A from location B. Mm-hmm. But then we have another pretty substantial percentage of those mobile bucks that are making multiple trips between the two home ranges, 4, 5, even 6 times during the year. And we've plotted when they make these movements across the time of the year, and there is no distinct peak or pattern that's identifiable. If you look at all the bucks that are changing home ranges in our southern studies, they are not doing it at any particular time that could be identified to say, oh yeah, this is when the bucks are doing their seasonal shifts. It's a variety. Now, some of the bucks are really consistent. The ones that make just distinct one time over and one time back, they do it pretty regularly or consistently. And we only have 2 or 3 years data on some of them, but they're really consistent between years. We had a buck that every February would move 13 miles, and every August he'd come back. And another buck that moved 17 or 18 miles every March, every August, plus or minus a few days, they'd be back. So thinking about that, the use of your trail cameras and scouting, if you see a buck that's come up and you see them in September or October for just a limited amount of time, make note of that and maybe watch for that buck coming back that next year at the same time. He may be on this regular pattern that, on any given year, it seems like crazy. And if you look at a bunch of different bucks doing different things, they're all crazy and they're hard to make sense of, but look at it as patterning types of bucks and then individuals as to when they're doing certain things.
I think that's the one thing that you can pretty reliably pattern, is we don't know where he went. We don't know why he went there. But one thing that is the most consistent part of that is those ones that pick up and move and go for a period of time and come back. Is the time at which they do it. Seems to be pretty consistent from year to year.
Yeah, and we've heard people say, oh, man, this migratory buck thing, that makes sense, because I've had this buck that he only shows up in October, and then he's here for a few months, and he goes, and I never see him the rest of the year. Well, yeah, that's a migratory buck you've got there.
Yeah.
And so, and those, one example I'm thinking of, we were told about, was from Pennsylvania. So, this is not just a summer phenomenon, a southern phenomenon. It happens in the north, and it's not just about moving into deer yards during the peak of the wintertime.
Right.
There's stuff going on here that makes deer so interesting.
Steve, while we're wrapping this one up, I would add one more little thing to Steve's question regarding your comment on food and cover. What are the things you can do? In his case, it sounds like he already has a lot of food because he's in an ag region, and he says winter wheat is very common. One thing you might want to do, and who knows if it will work, but if it were me, it would be something I would try, is planting something different that's not wheat. So it might be having a clover-dominated food plot, or clover and brassicas, but something besides what is so available all around might be important. And the other, and Steve, don't take this the wrong way, but I think you say in here there is substantial cover. I guess I would add that not all cover is alike, and so you might want to go through and see kind of what the average cover is there and see if you can make it even better, make it more dense or taller. And I would just tinker with it. And that's the good thing about spotting scopes and trail cameras and that sort of thing, is apply this type of stuff, take some notes, and see if it works. But if I were going to be proactive about, I got to do something, those would be the things I would try first.
And you're talking about bedding areas. We've got some pretty interesting MSU Deer Lab TV channel videos related to our buck movement study in central Mississippi, where we actually documented on the ground where specific adult bucks were bedding. We went in and filmed it. And there's a series of videos in bottomland hardwoods, and there's another video about examples from pine dominated habitats. So check out MSU Deer Lab TV and see some of these things firsthand.
Yeah. All right.
Well, Pat Jack has an interesting question asking about the effectiveness of deer scents for attracting deer, and then also he asks about the effectiveness of cover scents.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to start on that?
I'll give it a shot. He also says, has any research been performed on the effectiveness? I guess I'm going to give some real general answers here. I think there has been some research done. To me, what I have seen is I don't think there has been anything published that is conclusive that either of these are effective to the degree that I buy into it. And let me give a little bit of an explanation here. We got to think about how many different chemicals we emit, just us as humans, how many different chemical signatures we emit. And Steve, one time we worked with a colleague in the chemistry department because this stuff is really, really complicated, and it takes a world-class chemist to try to delve into this and understand it. And the acronym he used was VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And I just remember being overwhelmed with the number of volatile organic compounds that come off our skin, our breath, hundreds. Hundreds. And so I think it's very, very difficult to find a product that's going to suppress all of that. So there's that side of it, is we are a chemical stew and we stink. And there's a lot of different ways we stink. The other side of it is we got to think about a deer's sense of smell. And that's, of course, what we're trying to do with deer scents and cover scents and the type of clothing we use. And one thing I've always thought about, Steve, is how similar, at least we think how similar, a deer's sense of smell is to, say, a dog. And within dogs, let's think about a bloodhound. We know that the minute, hardly even measurable amount of scent that someone has to leave on the ground that a bloodhound can pick up. And not only can they, this just blows me away. Happens every day, and I still don't understand the sensitivity of a dog's nose. Not only can the bloodhound or tracking dog pick up the scent, they can walk a little bit right and a little bit left and determine the direction of the animal from seconds apart. A few seconds that step was taken, and they can say, that one is fresher. That one's more
there's a few more molecules in this direction than there were in that.
Yeah. It just blows me away. And here's another one, too. Think about our service dogs. And so for a service dog for a type 1 diabetic, a good service dog for a type 1 diabetic can be in the same room and in the air can detect if that person's blood glucose concentration is too high or too low.
Yeah.
Now sit back and think about that. They can take a whiff of the air within a room, even a large room, and can tell the blood glucose level of someone and the concentration too high or too low. Now, Steve, spray something on your boots and see if you can cover yourself up from a deer smelling you.
Yeah.
Not going to say it's impossible, not trying to sound like a fuddy-duddy. I can't reconcile the things we do to try to cover up our scent with knowing the capability of a dog's nose and knowing a deer's is as powerful, or who knows, maybe more.
Yeah, and just think about the shape, the size of the nose or the muzzle. Dog's muzzle is long, and the one reason it's long is because it has a lot of sensory tissue in the nasal passages to smell these things. Well, a deer, think about the length of the muzzle of a deer. Same thing, long and thin, jam-packed with sensory material in the nasal passages to smell stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to smell you. And I'm not going to say it doesn't help you some to spray or to wear something in particular that is going to help retard certain of those hundreds of chemicals, but you're not going to be able to cover up all of those hundreds of chemicals. And there's one thing you continuously do while you're on a stand or out hunting: you're breathing.
Yeah.
And hundreds of chemicals are coming out of your breath continuously. You can't spray your breath every time you're breathing, and you can't breathe through, you can't breathe through something and try to see the deer, So the bottom line is you have to, I know you're starting to say, quit rambling, Damaris, and get to the point. To me, the only thing you can control with absolute certainty on an individual deer is if you are downwind of the deer and it's not going to smell you. If you're upwind of the deer, it will smell you regardless of anything you do.
Yeah.
Cover scent, scent eliminator, clothing that you're wearing, you're going to be smelled. So work the wind to your favor. That's the best thing you can do.
Single most important proactive thing you can do.
In my mind.
Yeah, and I'll add to that a little bit more. So I'm rambling a little now, so there you go. Some of these measures, the type of clothing or a cover scent, it might suppress or it might confuse the deer. So we're not saying that it's impossible that they will never be effective at all. All we're simply saying is we don't think there's any way to completely conceal your scent or eliminate your scent. Some of those things may, maybe it gives you 30 more seconds to get the shot off. Maybe instead of the deer immediately, instantaneously knowing that's the smell of a human and flag comes up and gets out of there, maybe he pauses for 15 seconds and still later determines something's not right and gets out of there. Maybe some of those products or techniques can help in that regard, but I don't think there's any way. I would here would be a way to test if you knew somebody that had one of these tracking dogs. I'm saying bloodhound, but I think there's a lot of different breeds. If you can come somehow with your clothing and cover scent or scent elimination, if that dog can't find you, I'd say you got something good. And some people have done this. I've read this before where people have tried to do this, and I don't think they were ever successful of being able to hide yourself from a dog. So that was more than 2 cents. That's probably a nickel's worth right there, but that's kind of what I think. Now, one thing, Steve, we kind of went to the cover scent part of this. Deer scents for attracting. So doe and estrus scent or something like that could draw deer in.
I am absolutely, I believe that there are amazing chemicals that make a doe in estrus hugely attractive to a deer, to a buck. Absolutely. The ability to isolate those specific chemicals, and we've worked on that pretty hard, and then trying to replicate it, it's really, really difficult. And because we're talking about hundreds of chemicals and in different amounts and ratios and a lot of stuff, a lot of moving parts. So when you start trying to replicate that, it's difficult. And I remember a colleague from another university that tested some commercial scent products, and he looked for actual urine. This was years ago, and I'm not saying it's equivalent to what's being sold now, but I remember him looking years ago at the chemical composition of of one or more commercially available products, and he said I couldn't find the basic composition parts to urine in the jar. And maybe we don't want to say that.
Okay, Steve, next question is from Outdoor Enthusiast, Wisconsin. Buck activity in the morning versus afternoon during the bow season months. When are they most active, morning or afternoon?
I think generally, from our research data in the past and other data sets that I've seen, there's more activity, relatively speaking, in the morning than the late afternoon, because they've been active prior to dark, prior to sunrise. And so what you're seeing is that continuation of the really early morning prior to sunrise activity that deer do, and that's carried through into the early morning hours of the morning. And if you are then getting out of your stand and walking around at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, you're then kicking deer up and stimulating more movement as people come out of the woods. And the little editorial comment there, stay on your stand longer and you might see some more deer, and let somebody else kick the deer to you instead of you kicking the deer to them. And in the afternoon, there's general patterns of increased bedding during the day, and they're going to be starting to become more active in the late afternoon, leading into the early evening period of greater activity. So in the morning, you're leading into your morning with a high activity period. In the afternoon, you're leading into the afternoon with a non-active period. So I think it just has to do with what the previous hour or two was leading the deer to be doing.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, it's your position that the time period around sunup and sundown are similar in terms of general deer activity. It just might be that you capture a little bit more of it in the morning time.
Yes.
You just kind of have a greater amount of time. So let's just say around sunup, they're going to be moving 2,000 or 3,000 yards, and around sundown, they're going to be moving 2,000 or 3,000 yards. But you were able to see more of that movement during what amount of time after sunup versus the amount of time before sundown.
Yes.
Okay.
And usually a good hunter is going to be on their stand, 30 minutes before the sun's even thinking about coming up. And so you get in there and mess up what you're going to mess up coming in, but then you're quiet, and that scare that you put into the deer 30 minutes ago is now they've kind of, as long as you're downwind from them, they're not going to smell you, and they'll kind of reactivate their pattern of movement.
I have a little bit different strategy myself with that, Steve. I agree with what you said, but I got to follow up with it depends. It depends on if I know exactly where I'm going and how to get there. One thing I have stopped doing is making an effort to get to a stand or a location when it's completely dark and I don't exactly know where the tree is at or where the stand is at, and I'm meandering and making noise.
Oh, yeah.
I wait till as soon as, there's some visible light just so I can tiptoe and be quieter getting there.
Good point.
And I can't say that it's more effective or not, but it makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. And I think Outdoor Enthusiast asks about morning versus afternoon. And I think I think some of our data from our smartphone apps have shown sightings of deer are greater in the afternoon. But I think part of that has to do with there's probably more people hunting in the afternoon than there are in the morning, at least in the South. That's kind of, we're gentlemen hunters sometimes, and we just want to go out in the afternoon and enjoy watching the sun set as opposed to getting out in the dark and watching the sun rise.
Yeah. So there's a subtle difference there with the way you phrase that, but it makes a difference. So the question was buck activity, and we kind of generalized into deer movement, and then what you just said was relative to sightings.
Yes.
Well, we also know where most people hunt in the afternoons, and that's sitting on the food plot. So the deer are coming to you in the food plot, and so yeah, you may see more deer in the afternoon hunt versus in the morning hunt because maybe you weren't on the food plot.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean they were more active or less active. So kind of a little different question and a different answer.
Yeah.
But I would add one more thing before we move on, and yes, I'm rambling this time. I would not, based on what you said, he wraps up with morning or the afternoon. To me, Steve, if there's any difference at all, it would be a subtle difference. They're moving both in the morning and the afternoon. So I wouldn't take what we're saying as to I need to always hunt the morning because Damaris said they're not moving much in the afternoon. We're talking about degrees. I mean, barely some differences. They're moving a lot both in the morning and the afternoon.
Yes. That's a good point to leave on. I didn't want to confuse people with my rambling. This next question from Cooter Brown is really interesting. He doesn't say where he's from, but he asks about generally in the South, do buck bed in the same bed every time, or is it a general area, or do they move around? We've learned quite a bit about bedding areas in the last few years.
Yeah, and it's Cooter Brown 007.
Yes.
I need that 007 in there. So, yes, Steve, this is something we started tinkering with the data a few years ago because I guess it was believed, and some people were saying for some time, it was called the buck's bedroom. And it was, whether this was the intent of what people would say or just the way I understood it, I don't know. But the way I understood it was there's only a handful of places on the landscape where a buck is going to bed. And if you can figure out those one or two places, you've got them. And when we start looking at our data, nothing can be further from the truth. Bucks are bedding all over the place, all sorts of different beds. So it may be a week later, they may come back, not even to the same bed, but kind of in the same area. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. But I would not say that it's random bedding. That was where Cooter Brown wrapped it up. I wouldn't call it random. I would think it is very intentional where they're going. They have in their mind this map of all these different places that they can go. Some they probably prefer more than others, but a list of suitable places that they can bed. And that might be 30, 40, or 50 points.
Part of that, too, Bronson, is, a deer's going to have 5, 6, maybe even 7 feeding bouts throughout the day, depending upon the time of year. And they're going to feed, they're going to go somewhere to feed, and then they're going to take a break and chew their cud for a while, and they may not go too far from that particular feeding site to bed, and then they're going to get up from that after an hour or two of ruminating, chewing their cud, and then they're going to move to maybe another feeding area. And so to have 4, 5, or 6 bedding areas across a day isn't surprising if you understand what the deer are doing throughout the day. Right. It's not like us. We go to our bed and we spend 6, 7, 8 hours in our bed, in our bedroom every night. And then we go, to the kitchen for breakfast and we go to work or we go to school or, wherever we go. And then we come back every night. We're not deer and deer are not us. And they are taking little power naps to ruminate their food, chew their cud throughout the activity period when they're up and about feeding.
Right. That's right. Okay. I hope I'm not destroying this. Carson Seville, maybe? Is that how you would pronounce that one word? Steve, can you do a GPS tracker on a buck in a suburban area?
Short answer is yes, and it's been done. There have been studies, University of Georgia, some schools up in Wisconsin have done studies where they look at suburban-urban interface and even suburban-rural interfaces where looking at movements of deer. I remember a barrier island off of Georgia that had some intensive movement studies done looking at how the deer were utilizing that barrier island. And you can't just you can't just put a collar on. The average person can't buy a collar, might be a $3,000 GPS collar, and put it on a deer. You have to have appropriate scientific research permits from the Regulatory Wildlife Agency. You have to have approved protocols for darting and handling the deer and putting the collars, and it's really complex stuff. Not complex enough that you and I can't do it. I mean, we managed to do it, but it just takes a lot of effort. So it's not something that the average Jane or Joe can do, but it can be done, and it has been done. And I can't quote any specific statistics about how they may move differently in the urban environment or suburban environment than in the natural. I think they still have the same crepuscular patterns and morning, late night, early morning, and late afternoon into the evening, and then repeated feeding bouts during the night. I mean, they're still doing the same things. They're just doing it in a different place.
Right.
They're very adaptable animals. They are, how do we like to say it? They have a wide range of successional stages that they can live in. And a successional stage is just a particular plant community. And that plant community can be your backyard and just a small associated woodland. And that those deer just kind of live throughout your neighborhood during the nighttime, and they go back into that isolated woodland for the daytime.
And eat your flowers and shrubs during the night. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess that's the answer. Can a GPS tracker? Can you put a GPS tracker on a buck in a suburban area? Absolutely, you can.
And Carson, maybe some future episode we can get a guest that's worked in a suburban or urban area and talk to them, have them address this particularly, how deer behave in that environment.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. See, this is our last question.
Well, it's probably about time. I see an hour and 16 minutes into the podcast here.
Yeah, so you want to read this, or do you want me to?
I like this guy's handle or name, Mick Hunt and Fish. That's a good name. So I saw your postings. He's aware that we've covered a lot of info on bedding and GPS studies, very informative and interesting. His question relates to does and fawns. Do they prefer to bed close to major or designation food sources if good bedding cover is available? How do those patterns differ from mature bucks? What do you feel like answering that, Bronson?
Yeah, so my understanding is that does and fawns prefer to bed close to major or destination food sources if good bedding cover is available. I have not seen any study to particularly address this, but I don't think there's going to be really a big difference. I don't think we can come up with a rule or a pattern here and say, relative to food, does are going to do this in terms of where they bed, when they bed, etc., and bucks are going to do that. I just think it's going to be too variable, too individualistic. So I would just be wary And I've heard something about this over the past couple of years about some statements like this about relative to food, and then assigning a rule to it that relative to your food, your does are always going to X. Their beds are going to be right here. Your buck beds, they're always going to be over here. And usually the way I rationalize what is said is that the does are going to be in near proximity to the food, but those older, wary bucks, their bedding is going to be, hundreds of yards away. They're not going to be near the food. And hopefully, if people have listened to us, Steve, over the years, to me, that's going to be it depends. That's going to be deer are individuals. And I'm sure within a population of hundreds of deer, you were going to find some does that follow that pattern.
Mm-hmm.
You're also going to find some bucks that follow the pattern that they never are going to bed within 100 yards of a food plot. But I think you're also going to find just as many or more that don't follow the rule.
Well, I like we've been working on this movement publication that's going to be coming out hopefully within the next month or two as an MSU extension document. And we have this schematic that we put in there, and it was your brainchild, thinking like a deer,
mm-hmm.
and the kind of the pros and cons that deer think about, and they're trying to maximize or optimize food and security, and minimizing their energy expenditure while also minimizing risk. And it's this balancing act. And then when you turn into the male component during the breeding season, they're thinking like a deer, but with breeding opportunities as an additional weight on that seesaw and pushing it up and down in terms of what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And risk is really, really important in a lot of these equations. If you have, and there's been studies with wild populations of males versus females, and literally a dozen studies that have looked for patterns across the deer family around the world, looking for male versus female selection of habitats, and do males prefer different habitats than females. It all comes down to, in most cases, risk. And the females during the fawning time period, prior to fawning, during early fawning, and their main job is to produce fawns that are going to survive. And so they're going to be in the habitats that are the least risky for their fawns relative to natural predators. And those natural low risk areas may actually be lower quality food than other areas that are riskier, and you might find bucks in those better quality habitats with more food at those time periods, because they're not worrying about surviving fawns, they're just worrying about eating and growing some antlers. And
mm-hmm.
so there's these patterns between males and females that do exist on a large scale in natural environments that are tied to risk aversion and optimizing different things. Males optimizing food intake and antler growth during the summer, females optimizing survival of young. And if you have a pretty prevalent natural predator population in the summertime, it may be influencing those decisions significantly.
Well, I don't have anything as scientifically well thought out as that for a reply.
Well, I just made that up. I mean, it's not well thought out.
I was being nice. I could tell you were making it up.
Now, I do like to joke around. We both like to joke around, but I mean, that was based on real research. It's not made up.
Well, one thing too. So this is not using any of our studies for this answer. This is me being a hunter to try to address this question too. So I can think of a couple places I hunt where in the evening, for example, hunting over a food plot, and it varies all the time in terms of a group of does, a family unit of does and their offspring stepping out onto a food plot. And that may be an hour before sunset. And then 10 minutes, 15 minutes goes by, deer start. And then I specifically remember, too, this one situation where right at dark, here comes another doe group, comes out into the food plot. So to address that question, two things happen there. So either those two groups of does and fawns were very, very close to the food plot, and one group of does decided to get up and start feeding an hour before sunset, and the other one waited until almost dark and then comes to the food plot. Or, which is what I would bet is going on, one of those groups of does was relatively close to the plot where they were bedded. This other group was 5 times away. They were bedding in a completely different area, and the travel time for them to get there, it took 30 or 40 minutes. Mm-hmm. So there's just a lot of instances like that when we look at the data and we use hunting experience and things we've seen. I guess I would reply that I don't buy into that pattern. I don't think you can make a rule that does are always bedded adjacent to the destination food source and bucks are way off. I don't buy it.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
But we sure appreciate the question.
The wonderful question. Wonderful question. Well, Steve, we have rambled long enough. We have wasted a good hour of people's time with us rambling about deer, but I enjoyed it. Those are wonderful questions, and we appreciate everyone taking the time to send those in. That was good.
Yes, it's fantastic to have a lot of listeners and a lot of great listeners that are thinking. It's amazing. Some of these questions, they have all these qualifying statements and this and that, and these people are really thinking. We got a bunch of deer nuts that are listening to our podcast, and we appreciate
Absolutely. And we appreciate that because we're deer nuts too.
That's right.
All right, Steve. Until next time.
Take care. Good hunting.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.